Well, welcome to this edition of the Next Gen Discipleship webinar.
Well, thank you all for joining us. And my name is Jordan Littrell. I'm the Director of Youth Ministries at Cook's United Methodist Church in Mount Juliet. And I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Erik Carter, who is the Professor of Special Education at Vanderbilt University. And so I'm just going to hand it off to Dr. Carter. Dr. Carter, the stage is yours.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for being with us. It's a pleasure to be with you and to focus on the topic of belonging and to highlight some of what we're learning through our work with young people with disabilities and their families about what it means to be a church that's marked by belonging, and specifically a youth program that's marked by belonging for everyone in your community. And I think for members of our community who are sometimes wildly welcomed, but other times experience often deep wounding by the response of the church, this is a conversation that's really important to have and to think deeply about what it looks like to be that kind of place that supports every person to truly belong in all that we do as a gathering community. And my focus of my work really is on young people with labels like autism and Down syndrome and other intellectual disabilities. But as we move through this conversation, what I hope you see is that really the conversation about belonging is one that could be had about anyone in your congregation, whether or not they have a disability or not. And so I'd really challenge you to be thinking about how the ideas that I share ultimately get expressed in the church that you're part of and in the youth programs that you lead in particular. So let's start by just thinking together about this notion of belonging. And have you ever really thought about what it means to belong in a community? What does it mean for youth to really belong within your program or in the community that you've gathered within your church? And if you began to really reflect on your own church of which you're a part, what would be the things that you would point to that would tell you you really do belong there? Well, that's a question that we've been looking at quite a bit as we think about belonging in people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. What does it look like to push past merely having people integrated in our programs or even included in our programs, but to truly and deeply experience belonging? We know that people want to be more than just included. They want to be more than just present. They want to have the relationships and the presence that really makes them feel like part of a place. But belonging is one of those things that's really hard sometimes to define. We know it firsthand. We feel it deeply when it's absent, when we don't feel like we belong. But what would be the things that we could point to that would become markers of belonging for people with disabilities? So I'd like to draw upon what we've learned through the stories and study of nearly 500 young people with disabilities. These were all young people ages 13 through 21 who are connected in some way to a local congregation. And we talked to them about their experiences and their stories within their churches. And what we often heard as we had those conversations was these ideas that kept circling back to the attitudes and the actions and the experiences that lead them to feel like they belong there. And in the midst of all those conversations, really 10 key dimensions emerged. People felt like they belonged when they were present, when they were invited, when they were welcomed, when they were known, when they were accepted, supported, cared for, befriended, needed, and loved. And I'm going to spend the rest of my time walking through each of these 10 dimensions and challenging you to think about in your own youth programs, how are young people with labels like autism or intellectual disability or other types of disabilities experiencing each of these 10 different dimensions of belonging? And in fact, how might anyone in your youth program be experiencing these different dimensions? So some questions to be reflecting on are, what are you doing really well right now in each of these 10 areas? What are some things that you could be doing better or more of, or maybe even entirely differently? And my hope is that through watching this webinar, you'll begin to think, what are the next one or two steps that we could take to really become a gathering community that's marked by these different dimensions? So let me start with the first one of those dimensions, and that is presence. And belonging always begins with presence. And in fact, it's the absence of people with disabilities that really is the challenge in so many youth programs and churches around our state and all across our country. They're just not present in our worship and service and learning and social activities that make up congregational life. And we all know this firsthand. You can't have a presence in a community if you're not actually present in that community. It's just hard to feel like you're part of the community from really on the margins or the peripheries. And yet in the data that we collect as part of our studies of how congregations are moving in these areas, we realize that ministry apart from people with disabilities is too often the dominant ministry model in churches around our state and often around our country. We know that when we look at the involvement of adults with intellectual and developmental disability, only about half of all adults with disabilities are part of a local congregation and have attended any kind of religious services in the last month. We have more than half of families in our studies tell us they've kept their son or daughter from being part of a youth program or religious activity because there just wasn't support provided. More than 2/3 of all teens or have no involvement. Teenagers with disabilities have no involvement with a youth group or other small group. That means only 1/4 of young people who would like to actually are part of a local youth program. And actually only about 1 in 5 churches offers any kind of support for young people with developmental disabilities, whether that's within their religious programs, religious education, or maybe that's support for parents or any kind of respite opportunities. So great opportunities here to reverse these numbers. And it raises questions about what's standing in the way of people first just being there, of being present. Is it barriers of awareness or attitude or access? All of those things that can abound in churches. And sometimes it's even barriers of architecture that people just can't get in. And hopefully that's not a barrier in your church, but historically it has been in lots of our churches. I always share this picture at presentations. It's what I thought was the most inaccessible church in the world because it's built into the side of this mountain. It has 1,000 steps to get up to it. And people started, of course, then sharing with me even more inaccessible churches like this one that I think just takes that inaccessibility to new heights in many ways. And I share these because they sort of illustrate in kind of a comical way some of the challenges that we're talking about getting into a place. But I would really just encourage you to think about whether there are subtler barriers that really send the same message in our churches. Whether it's this set of steps that someone can't get into or up into where your youth program gathers, that one step that prevents someone from coming into that building or into that room. And it causes us to think about, does our buildings in some way communicate something about our theology? What does that one step on this picture say? What is the curriculum that some kid can't access, or the classrooms that people can't get into, or the pulpit that people can't get up to, say about how we think about who should be part of our gathering community? Now, more and more, less and less, I should say, architectural issues are what's standing in the way, but it is worth just reflecting on that and thinking about, does where our youth program gather, is that in an accessible space? Does where do we go to retreats or trips or mission trips, ensure that it's accessible to anyone who would want to be part of that? So I'll put in your links here just a whole host of congregational assessments that you can use to reflect on whether the facilities that you're gathering in are actually accessible. I'm not an expert on architecture. You don't have to be. There are some great guides that can really walk you through this process. So as you think about presence, you might just be thinking about, what are we doing really well right now? Are there young people with disabilities who are already part of our youth programs? If so, that's great. Let's celebrate that. But if not, are there things that you should be doing better or differently or more of to ensure that presence isn't the barrier to people belonging? So the second dimension that we heard from families was really about invitations, because when people aren't present, it often requires us then reaching out and extending some new invitations to people who aren't already part of our gathering community. And if we're not intentional about doing that, reaching out into the community to invite people with disabilities, we inadvertently end up leaving people out. As one pastor that we spoke with reflected, it's not that we deliberately exclude people with disabilities. In fact, we weren't deliberate at all. that was the problem. And I think that's the challenge, is we assume because we proclaim that our youth program or our church or whatever is welcoming, a place for everyone, that is what people are actually hearing who've had a history of exclusion from churches or youth programs. We want to proclaim that we're welcoming on our websites, on our church signs like this one, on all our outreach materials, but there's something fundamentally different about actually being personally invited. An announcement about our welcome is different than us reaching out and saying, hey, we want you here. We're incomplete without you. And so this requires us to think differently. An invitation, that's a personal thing. An announcement's not. An invitation really does say, I am thinking about you. And unfortunately, an announcement leaves open that possibility that there is a kind of a little asterisk or unspoken qualifier on our invitation, that everybody's welcome as long as you sort of fit our mold or we're comfortable with you being part of our gathering community. And the reason I emphasize something that probably seems a little bit odd here to park on for so long is that in our own research, we found that many families have changed their place of worship because their son or daughter was not welcomed in a youth program or Sunday school program or whatever children's ministry was available at that church. That's the story for nearly 1 in 3 families in our studies, which means there is a little asterisk. And so when we say, hey, we're welcoming of people with disabilities, but their history has been that welcome wasn't always honored, we have to sort of back that up with a personal commitment that this time will be different, that we really do mean we want you here when we say all are welcomed. So I think that really leads us to think about when we're thinking about invitations to reach really deep and wide into our local communities to make sure that everyone who's present in the community is actually invited to be part of what we're doing in our youth programs or elsewhere. About 19% of any community identifies as having a disability. And if you went to your local school system, you'd find that 15% of all kids in the local schools receive special education services. So you can kind of do the math and think about, okay, what's the size of my community that we're serving as a church? And what's 15 to 20% of the individuals who live in that community? And that's the number of people that are potentially awaiting those invitations that so often aren't intentionally extended. We live in the state of Tennessee. There are 6.7 or 8 million people here. That means there's about 1.3 million kids and adults with disabilities in this state alone, about 150,000 people with labels like autism and intellectual disability. So that biblical question of who is my neighbor certainly includes people with disabilities. Now, the statistics always seem a little bit abstract. I think it's more helpful to think very concretely about all right, let's think about the neighbors that surround our local church, the neighborhoods that we're trying to reach youth out in. If we were to walk out of our congregation into a neighborhood like the one I've put up on the screen here, which could be yours, for example, and we started knocking on doors that surrounded our church of these homes, what we would find is that 1 out of every 3 or 4 households whose doors we knocked on would include a family member who has a disability. And you see how many homes that reflects, and that's just one neighborhood. So there are opportunities that surround us right now to think about how do we start reaching out and personally saying, we need you here. We want you to be part of our program. Presence, the absence of presence in your community is not because people aren't present in the community. It requires something else. So third, what we heard from families is beyond just being there and actually being pursued or being invited is to be welcomed when we arrive. And we often say that it's welcome is not really the thing we say. It's not that we go up and greet someone, although that's part of it. It's actually how someone feels. And we as the hosts in our churches are not the ones who define what is welcoming. It's actually the stranger, the guest, who determines what that is. And so we communicate that welcome through personal encounters with people. But for so many people with disabilities, the story we hear is that welcome is not always experienced. And I think there's some obvious reasons for that. We're sometimes uncertain about what to say or do. how do we welcome someone who doesn't speak, who has complex communication needs, who has a disability label that we're not familiar with? And we start to get reluctant about what to say or what to do. And we start to worry about whether we'll say or do the wrong thing. And what happens is that uncertainty that we feel almost always leads to avoidance. And then people start to feel unacknowledged or even overlooked, sometimes even ignored, because our reluctance creates this barrier to interactions. And you know what? When that happens, people stop coming. So I think what we're really hearing from individuals and families is a call to hospitality, a call to welcome when we arrive. And it looks pretty ordinary, actually, more than it does extraordinary. It's about greeting new families when they arrive and making sure they're introduced to other people and to making sure kids are welcomed and then introduced to others, drawing them into conversations, inviting them to be part of activities, giving them active and leadership roles, inviting them to other church events. Those are the kinds of ordinary actions that we do for anyone, but we sometimes forget or neglect to do for people with disabilities and their families. It's the ordinary actions that make families like this parent say, we just felt like we were wanted. And that's the message that we want to communicate, that you are deeply wanted here, deeply needed. The great thing about this sort of welcome and hospitality is you don't have to be an expert in disability to do it. You don't have to know a whole lot about disability to make people with disabilities feel really welcomed. It's more about knowing how to welcome anyone. I do think sometimes there's some things that can give you a bit more confidence. Sometimes having a little bit of guidance maybe about the language you should use or etiquette of how to interact with someone who has a visual impairment or uses a wheelchair, or just some knowledge about what your congregational supports might be for that individual can give you a little bit more confidence and allow you to step in that space. We'll post some links you can where you can follow and sort of just get some basic disability etiquette and language info that might give you some more confidence. We can do that along with this webinar as well. But I think just some kind of guidance on what to do when someone shows up who seems to be a stranger to that community. What do you say? What do you do? How do you connect them very quickly? And being intentional about what that might look like. So in addition to being present and invited and welcomed, families also talked about being known. And this is the fourth dimension of belonging. People come, they're strangers to our community, but they're not supposed to stay strangers to our community. They're supposed to move from stranger to friend, and that involves really becoming known. And what was interesting for in our own research and conversations with families and youth is they were partly talking about being known personally. That was one dimension of it. Do people know my name rather than know me by my label? That was an element of what these families and individuals were talking about, that we feel often like we're known as a group of those people with disabilities or something like that. But there was actually something deeper that they were talking about when they talked about becoming known. And that was really about how their sons and daughters were known. Not first and foremost by their disability labels, but by their names. And not first and foremost by what their kids struggled to do or their deficits, but rather by their gifts and their strengths and their passions. And this is a different way of talking about and thinking about and coming to know people with disabilities. So often in our minds are these definitions that I've put on your screen that I do not want you to write down and remember, but these are the sort of formal professional definitions of autism or intellectual disability. And you start to see as you read through them that they emphasize deficits and limitations and struggles. And so I can imagine you as a youth minister, someone approaching you and saying, well, how do we welcome people with autism? Or how do we welcome someone with an intellectual disability into our youth program? And if your only image of that person is the kinds of definitions you see on the screen, it gets really hard to figure out, well, how do we find a place for someone on the basis of what they can't do? And I would really challenge that as a way of coming to know people with disabilities. It's hard to find a place for deficits, and congregations are built on the idea that every single person brings strengths that make them indispensable in a community. So the challenge and the important step that you have to take is to come to know people with disabilities, not by that label, but by all the gifts and experiences and qualities that they bring to that community. We did another study where we simply asked families to tell about the strengths and qualities that their sons and daughters have. And the words that they came up with were things like kindness and empathy and humor and gratitude and optimism and forgiveness and courage. These were the kinds of gifts and positive traits that their sons and daughters have, but that people struggled to see because all they saw was the label and the disability. As youth leaders, we have to make sure we're coming to see people in very different ways. And that means coming alongside them and truly knowing them and their story and the things they bring to that community. Well, that brings us to the fifth dimension of belonging, which was being accepted. And just like the prior dimension that I talked about, acceptance comes from actually being known and being in relationship with people. It's not about some kind of awareness campaign where we do something informational about what autism is or what Down syndrome is. It's about getting people in relationship with one another, and their preconceived ideas of what someone with a disability is like get quickly overturned as they come to know them personally, one-on-one, intimately. That's what families and individuals are talking about, of their child being welcomed without condition, of being treated like family, of being embraced for all they are. And what strikes us is while we presume always that we are welcoming places as faith communities, that's not always the experiences of people with disabilities and their families. When we asked parents to share their views about whether their current church was accepting of their son or daughter with a disability, only a little more than half, 55%, strongly agreed that clergy and congregational leaders welcome their child. And only less than half, about 48%, strongly agreed that other congregation members accepted their child. So there are opportunities here to think about how we really create a culture of acceptance in our local congregation and in our youth program. I collect statements from families that are often very heartbreaking and very wounding that reflect that kind of attitudinal barrier to really belonging in a church. And you'll see some of these on your screen. I won't talk about each of them, but they just reflect a posture that in some way, either we don't really know how to serve kids like your kid, or that we're not the kind of place that's really committed to making sure our welcome has no caveats or asterisks on it. I do think there are some things that you can do as a church if you are interested, to begin to kind of create some of that awareness. It is often helpful to do some kind of formal disability awareness, maybe Sunday, or we sometimes call them inclusion awareness Sundays or access Sundays, or to do that as part of a youth program event. There are some churches that kind of embed just some awareness information into maybe units or curricular units or activities in their program. But again, I think the most promising way to really promote awareness and acceptance is by finding ways of creating contact and interactions between people with and without disabilities. And ultimately, those perceptions that we have get really challenged when we realize that this is a person with personality and a story and talents and things that make them absolutely worth getting to know. I will say that what ultimately gets communicated from church leadership is also really important here. And for you who are youth leaders, what gets communicated from you as well. And I, sort of heard stories over the years about sort of people's church stories about leadership who kind of get it. And so here's some examples of those. To me, pastors who sort of get that acceptance piece. But if you've got a pastor or a priest or clergy who are completely unfazed when someone answers their rhetorical questions out loud, that's a sign that you've got sort of this atmosphere of acceptance. If you've got a pastor who can designate the entire sanctuary a no shush zone where you're not allowed to turn and tell anyone to be quiet, that sort of has this sort of atmosphere of acceptance. If you've got a pastor who, instead of making the noisy person go off to the cry room because they're making a bit of noise, but instead says, we're going to have everyone go to the cry room who can only worship in total silence. We'll send them to the cry room, and everyone who's okay with a little kind of noise and movement can stay in the sanctuary. It flips where we see the barriers. So often we sort of think the person's behavior or their disability is the thing that stands in the way of inclusion, but sometimes it's the way we've chosen to gather and the very narrow ways and narrow boundaries we put on behavior and acceptable participation. So it's a challenge for us to think a little bit differently about that. So that takes us to the sixth dimension that becomes important, and this is just the issue of support. Many people with autism or intellectual disability are going to need additional support to be part of your youth programs or to be part of other aspects of the life of your particular congregation. And so you want to make sure that you're thinking about how you individualize those supports so that they can participate alongside everyone else. And this is the place where you don't need to make presumptions. You don't have to guess at what those supports would be. I think it's a place to actually invite input. And interestingly, this doesn't happen a lot, but in our studies, we found that really just under half of parents with children with intellectual and developmental disabilities said they'd never been asked by anyone in their congregation the best way to include their son or daughter with a disability. So simple response to that is just to ask some good questions. And I don't know what families are going to say, and I don't know what youth will say, but there are some questions that you can work through to begin to better understand the child and what it looks like to make Sunday morning or Wednesday night or Friday night or whenever your youth program gathers the very best day of the week for that child. So a church I was part of a number of years ago, we would simply take out families for coffee and work through some of the questions that you see here on your screen that just helped us better understand who their child is and the ways they'd like to participate, the spiritual goals they had for their son or daughter, and the kinds of supports that they thought would be most helpful. And then our commitment as a church was to do the very best we could at beginning to put those supports in place. And so rather than having families having to go and do the advocacy with the church, the person who would hear their story would go back and talk with the youth minister or the children's minister or whoever it might be and do that kind of asking on their behalf and say, here's some things I heard that might be helpful for this child or for this family. Let's see what we can do to put some of those things in place. And then our posture as a church was always, we're going to do the very best we can, but we're probably going to mess this up. In fact, we'll probably mess this up a lot, but if you'll stick with us, we're committed to you and your child. And we want to do it well, so help us do that. And I think that posture really resonates with families. And so I think that's what I would encourage you all to consider is just to figure out some way of having some dialogue with families about what it would look like to support not people with autism, but to support their child Sam or Samantha or Elena or Evan, and think individually about what that might look like. Now, we have done a study actually asking families about what kinds of support might be helpful, and I thought it would be interesting to share what we learned from families with you all as well. In our study of about 500 parents of adolescents with disabilities, we asked them about 14 different supports, and I've put them all up on your screen. For each of those supports, we asked them which of these would be helpful, and they could say somewhat to very helpful, a little helpful, or not at all helpful. And this might just give you a flavor of the kinds of things that you could consider doing. 70% of families said just those disability awareness efforts would be really helpful, just creating an atmosphere of welcome and a commitment to inclusion of people with disabilities in your congregation. About 69% said just some kind of resources for us as families. We're often struggling as parents of adolescents in general, and you add on to that the different dimensions of disability, and life can be pretty challenging. So if you know some places to help kind of connect us or point us, that can often be helpful as well. An advocate for families, this sounds more formal than it really is. By advocate, it's just like I mentioned a couple slides ago, someone who just sits down with them and helps, hears their story and then helps do the asking on their behalf. Many of these families are advocating 5 days a week in school systems. They're advocating in healthcare systems to get their needs met. And the last place they want to have to put on the advocate hat again is in their church, not there of all places. So just making sure there's a person who's thinking about the needs of these families and these youth, and just intentional about trying to address those needs. Other things, I won't read through all the numbers, but things like spiritual counseling from a congregational leader, a support group of some kind for families, respite care, some opportunity for those families just to be able to go out, have a date, make a run to the grocery store or take a nap or whatever it might be. And in fact, your youth program, if it does Inclusion Well, might very well be that one time of the week that those parents have to just relax and be together. And that's a huge ministry in and of itself. They talked about maybe some modifications to any kind of religious education program, some ways that their son or daughter could participate, an intentional plan for how their son or daughter would be supported, actual support in your youth program or religious education program, support during worship services, and all the way down, you can see. It's interesting, the thing that came up least often was actually a more accessible congregation. And that's not something that would have come up least often 10 or 20 years ago, but I think we've made great strides to just make sure our churches in general are places that people can actually get in. So as you look across these different supports on your screen, you can see how different ones sort of emerged as more or less important for families. The striking thing for us in our project was, in addition to asking whether these would be helpful supports, we also asked whether their congregation actually offered any of these supports. And the numbers that are now popping up on the right of your screen in orange are the percentage of churches that actually do any of these things. Only 10% of churches do any kind of disability awareness efforts, despite the fact that 70% of families are saying that would be really helpful. Only 6% have any kind of resources for these families. Only 4% any kind of person who's just thinking intentionally about the needs of people impacted by disability. And you can see all the numbers all the way down. To me, the ministry opportunity here lies between these two numbers. How can we begin to make sure some of these things are available for the families in our local congregation? Now, as you look at this list, don't go back and say, I've got 14 different things I need to do. My point is, these are the things that families tend to say would be helpful. You can learn what would be actually helpful by sitting down and asking them one at a time. Don't presume these are the things that your families will need, because there was no two families that identified the same set of helpful supports as any other. It was so individualized. And so that's really important. You may be also wondering, well, I don't really know how to implement any of those supports. Well, we've put together a guide that, at least for the next 24 hours, is completely free. And then after that, it's also free. It's always free, actually. So the link is on the bottom of your screen, and it walks through each of those 14 supports, tells you a little bit about why it's important, gives some of the data that I just shared with you, and points you to some resources that can help you implement that in your own local church. So hopefully that's a resource that can help guide you. And of course, you can reach out to me by email or elsewhere too, or some other way if you have additional questions about that. But support moves people from presence to actual participation. And it's really important to consider. So that takes us to the seventh dimension of belonging, and that was just to be cared for. And I think this is something that just healthy faith communities do all the time. They strive to meet the emotional and spiritual and relational and practical needs of their members. And so we want to make sure we're also doing that for young people with disabilities who are part of our congregations. And I think there's some opportunities for us, given the number of churches in our cities, particularly here in Tennessee, where there's a church on every corner, it seems like, to begin to think about how can we come to start to meet deep needs in our community for people with disabilities that extend beyond what happens on Sunday morning or on Wednesday night or whenever we gather as a youth program. There are a lot of churches. This is a map of Nashville, Tennessee, and every red dot is a different church. So my point is, lots of congregations, and I wonder if we're willing to in some way think collectively as the capital C church about how we can meet some needs that extend beyond the boundaries of our church. The poverty rate for people with disabilities is twice what it is for people without disabilities. The employment rate for young people with intellectual disability and autism is about 10%. About 10% of young people with disabilities are working. That means their unemployment rate is 90%. Connections to relationships and just community activities are often pretty limited. So there's actually an opportunity for us to think about, what are all the important experiences for adolescents and young adults? Going through school, developing friendships, finding a job, or being part of your community. These are actually things that churches could also step into and think of as actually a form of ministry. And I'll just highlight an example. I can't go too long on it, but we've put together a resource called Putting Faith to Work, which simply invites churches to help connect their youth with disabilities to jobs, maybe a first job or a second job in their local community. As they come to know that youth with a disability, they get to know their strengths and their passions, and then they start to realize that their church maybe has 100 or 200 different businesses and organizations that are represented by people who go to that church. So when they know something about this young person and what they'd like to do and what their gifts are, they start to ask who in our church works in a place that could use someone just like this. And through just some networking, the way lots of people get their jobs, they end up networking until that young person's connected to a job. Project we did here in Tennessee ended up connecting nearly 60 people with disabilities to jobs simply by having people who cared about them and listened to their sense of calling and then networked through their church and beyond, ended up helping these kids connect to great jobs. That's a different way of thinking about ministry that helps really help the broader needs that young people have as well. So do think beyond the traditional ways of meeting the needs of youth and stepping into their lives the other 6 days of the week as well, and learning about what needs they might have that people in your church could also step in and address. That's the idea of being cared for. All right, eighth dimension is relationships. And, it's clearly a theological point, but it's also an empirical finding that we were made for relationships, that intimacy and companionship and the reciprocity, the support that comes through friendships, that is at the core of our own thriving. In fact, there's a study big study that's come out recently that just essentially found that loneliness is a bigger health risk than obesity and smoking, interestingly. So it has a greater mortality risk than those things. So being alone isn't just a hard thing, it actually hurts and can actually kill if you think about it in those dimensions. And relationships become so important here because all of the other dimensions of belonging that I've talked about can almost be done at arm's length. Like you can invite someone, you can welcome them briefly, you can even accept them and know them, but friendships really take belonging to a deeper level. And this, I think, is a challenge for many of us in our youth programs of how do we move from people just being present in our programs to actually having deep friendships with others in our church. And the numbers tell us that those friendships that are so foundational, so fundamental to our own flourishing, they just don't happen automatically for youth with disabilities. In one national study of high school students with autism, they found that 51%, more than half of all youth with autism, had not been invited to any other kid's social activity, not once in the last 12 months. Not at all, not a birthday party, not a football game, not a sleepover, nothing. And for adults, as they exit high school and go into adulthood, 1 in 4 adults with intellectual disabilities has no relationship in their life beyond family members and paid support staff. This is a place where the church can make a profound difference. And this is a place where I think it really highlights the importance of what we do between our Sundays. It's about getting together beyond the walls of our congregation and finding ways of connecting kids, not only in our youth programs, but also in just ordinary life activities that take place throughout the rest of the week. About getting kids involved together in favorite hobbies, going to the local mall, catching a movie, going to the park, catching the big game together, whatever it might be that kids do or adults do together. to invite people with disabilities to be part of those ordinary activities that anyone's part of, but that don't often happen automatically unless we're intentional about fostering those relationships. And I think this is a place where, like I said, the church can really have a profound impact because we know how to foster relationships, and we also know how to foster them among people with and without disabilities. The ninth dimension of belonging that we heard from families also reflects a shift in ministry posture from ministry to people with disabilities to ministry by people with disabilities. Individuals and families come to feel needed in a congregation when people see them as bringing gifts and talents that benefit the entire community, then are ultimately essential to the whole community's thriving. And there's a reciprocity that happens as people do develop those friendships, where we started to think, you know what, I'm kind of doing this inclusion thing for someone with a disability. We come to realize that we get as much as we give, and sometimes more. And there's deep reciprocity there, that there isn't one person who's the designated recipient of support or the receiver of help, that we actually have much to gain from getting involved in the lives of people who we think maybe need us. It turns out we need them just as much. And we know that scripturally. We know that from the passage in 1 Corinthians 12 that really punctuates that point of every person being indispensable, of every gift being needed, which means there are people who need those gifts as well. This is a church sign I took a picture of, different denomination. I hope that's okay. But it's right down the street from where I live up in Goodlettsville, Tennessee. And I don't think they were talking about disability at all when they put this sign up, but I read it in light of that. It's a posture I wish every congregation had, every youth program had, that when they think about people with disabilities and they read that passage, they say, we need you here ASAP. We think the church is incomplete without the presence and the participation of people with disabilities. And when we read that passage in 1 Corinthians in light of that, and this is, of course, a paraphrase of the message, we stop thinking about inclusion as something nice to do because it's good for someone else. We start to realize that's actually what makes our community stronger and is what the way our community was designed to be. And when we think about this in light of people with disabilities in that way, we don't wait until people arrive to begin to welcome them. We start pursuing them because their gifts are missing. And I think it also challenges us to think about, rather than trying to tinker and retrofit what we do so it might work if people with disabilities show up, we start moving people with disabilities from an afterthought to a forethought. And when we design our youth programs or our retreats or mission trips or whatever we do as a youth program, at the outset, we assume that people with disabilities are going to be part of that, and we make sure it's designed with an accessible mindset in mind right at the outset. Well, that takes us to the 10th dimension of belonging, which I know you never thought I would get to, but we're here. And that is love. And, you obviously don't need a researcher from Vanderbilt to tell you how love is so deeply connected to belonging. Of course it is. And at the core of our scriptural call is to be communities marked by love, love for God, love for our neighbor, and love for our neighbors with disabilities. And there's a giant in my own field of special education whose name is Wolf Wolfensberger. I was really a powerful voice in actually closing down lots of the institutions where people with disabilities used to be sent not that long ago. And one of the things that he said in one of his pieces of writing was the idea that healing for people with disabilities who have been wounded by exclusion or wounded by exclusion from our communities, begins with three messages: that you are valuable, that you are as valuable as any other person, and that you are deeply loved by those around you. And so that posture of deep love is also essential for people with disabilities as well. So that's belonging. And it's a simple idea that we often think that we grasp, but when we start to unpack it, we see there's different aspects of it where we might be doing some really well and some aspects not quite as well as others. So the opportunity for you as you think about your youth programs is to begin to reflect on what you do and how you gather, and begin to think about this. Are youth with disabilities personally invited into all that you do? Are they present in all aspects of how you gather as a youth program or how you do congregational life? Are they experiencing a warm welcome when they arrive? Are they well known all throughout your faith community, not just by their label, but by their name and by their gifts and by the things they bring to relationships? Are they accepted without any caveat or condition as people who belong there and ought to be there? Are they provided the support they need to be part of all you do as a gathering community in all aspects of your youth programming? Are they receiving care in ways that enable them to flourish in all aspects of their life? Are they developing friendships with others in the youth program in ways that really lead them to feel known and that they know others? People who notice, who know when their birthday is and make sure it's celebrated well. Are there people who notice when they're not there and follow up to find out why? Are there people who miss them when they're not present? Those are all indicators of that sense of being befriended. And then, of course, are they needed? Are they seen as indispensable within your community and ultimately loved deeply and unconditionally? So I hope these will provide some points of reflection for you as you think about your own gathering community and begin to ask questions like, what are we doing really well in these areas for people with disabilities? And what could we be doing more of or better or differently? And I would even say you could step back and say, how could we reflect on these 10 dimensions of belonging for anyone who's part of our youth program? Is any young person feeling like they're invited and welcomed and known and befriended and needed and loved? And perhaps this is a way of thinking about the movements we might make as we move forward to become that kind of community that's ultimately marked by deep belonging and full inclusion. So hope this is helpful, and look forward to seeing what you might do and how you might take this work and move it forward in your own local congregation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carter. And a lot of the resources that you shared the links to will also be linked as well whenever the video is posted. So thank you for everything. I know that I got a lot out of this, and I'll be taking this back to the rest of my congregation and implementing it as well in the ministries that I lead. So thank you so much, Dr. Carter, and appreciate all that you do.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thanks.